there are people who make a mistake and admit they made a mistake, and they move as quickly as possible in the direction of fixing the mistake that they made. There are other people who make a mistake and they double down, either because their ego won't allow them to admit defeat or because they genuinely can't change their mind and consider that they might have actually done something wrong. Donald Trump is in the latter camp. He doesn't admit to making mistakes. He usually does double down, even on the worst mistakes that he's made. And right now, one of the biggest mistakes that Donald Trump has made in his still early presidency is the trade war that he has started. And Donald Trump is doubling down, and he's doubling down so hard on this that he's started to make completely wild and wacky claims with no connection to reality whatsoever. The reality of the tariffs that Donald Trump has placed on American allies around the world is that they're going to hurt American businesses and also American workers. That's the reality. Trade wars are not good or easy to win, despite Donald Trump saying that they're good and easy to win. The tariffs are going to make American products more expensive around the world. That's going to hurt American businesses. It'll hurt workers. The tariffs are going to lead to retaliatory tariffs from our allies that will make their products more expensive for us. That's also bad for Americans who aren't necessarily swimming in extra money with which to purchase foreign goods. And Donald Trump most recently, this is so whacked out, has suggested that the tariffs might be so good for the United States that the revenue created by the tariffs could conceivably make the federal income tax unnecessary. And this is so silly that it's hard to know whether it even warrants a response or if it's just an example of how disconnected this man is from reality. I'm going to play video for you. Trump is saying that the tariffs could be so good that it could be like when McKinley was president of the United States in the late 19th century. What the hell does Donald Trump know about William McKinley? And that the United States didn't even need income taxes at the time because just tariffs can be so good. It is completely perverted logic, but it's sort of what Donald Trump seems to be applying to this situation. Take a look.
30% tariff on. So tariffs could be a very positive thing. You know, in the old days when we had tariffs, we didn't have income tax. When people wanted to come in, you look at the days of McKinley and some others, when people wanted to come in, they had to pay a price. When they want to come in and raid our treasury, they had to pay a price. We didn't have income tax. You didn't need income tax. We didn't have debt. So we're doing this, I will say, in every instance, every country, any country that you can mention has been extremely nice.
So what he's saying is, in previous times, when we had tariffs and no income taxes, things worked really well. So therefore, his tariffs now are a good thing. Now, it's just so you have the data. Federal spending as a portion of the total economy is 10 times higher now than it was during the McKinley era that Donald Trump references. So as a comparison, this is totally meaningless. This is the type of math that leads to bankrupt casinos. And it is not that shocking that the guy who thinks trade wars are good and easy to win and knows nothing about taxes and has no clue how to run a government might think that maybe if you do really well with the tariffs, you wouldn't even really need the federal income tax.
Yeah, when McKinley was president, we didn't have Social Security, we didn't have Medicare, our military wasn't what it is now.
Yeah.
It wasn't, 15 government departments and countless more agencies.
Well, careful,
This is just unsustainable.
Careful, because that's the logic they'll use to say, well, we got to get rid of all that stuff. We got to shrink Social Security, and we've got to get rid of a bunch of those government departments, right? So you got to be careful with that logic.
Military can stay big, though, at least.
Oh, military can double. Absolutely. We need it much bigger. Sometimes I listen to this stuff and I think back to my high school economics class. There were students in my high school econ class who seemed to have a better grasp of these big economic issues and fundamentals than Donald Trump has. And I want to mention the McKinley thing. The fact that Trump mentioned President William McKinley, who was president starting in 1897, this isn't something Trump is an expert on. If Trump is mentioning William McKinley, it's because somebody told him, mention William McKinley. I don't think anybody at this point believes that Donald Trump is a casual historian who knows a lot about President William McKinley, such that he could make this comparison in this casual way. I would point to either Stephen Miller or I don't even know, a Koch brother or someone who has Trump's ear on this stuff.
It's like when Stephen Bannon got him interested in Andrew Jackson.
That's exactly right.
And then the comparisons started and didn't really end.
This is absolutely ludicrous. It is a gong show, a comedy of errors, harebrained idea after harebrained idea. I don't know what analogy or phraseology you want to apply to it, but we are in a period where total ignorance and saying whatever comes to mind or whatever somebody said in your ear 5 minutes before a camera got turned on is being accepted as some kind of truth-telling, tough guy, patriotic gospel. I don't even know what other word to apply to it, and it is stunningly disturbing. Donald Trump gave another one of these rambling, incoherent speeches that were so bizarre that you couldn't tell whether the teleprompter switched to Mandarin in the middle of the speech or maybe Trump was having some kind of medical incident, because no sensible explanation came to mind other than total incompetence. And we know that Donald Trump recognized that the public relations around caging little kids was bad. Who could have guessed, right? And so in an attempt to fight back against what Trump saw as bad publicity about his immigration policy, he put together people whose family members were allegedly killed by, quote, criminal illegal aliens. Here's a little bit of Donald Trump's bizarre, rambling, incoherent speech.
We're gathered today to hear directly from the American victims of illegal immigration. You know, you hear the other side, you never hear this side. You don't know what's going on. These are the American citizens permanently separated from their loved ones. The word permanently being the word that you have to think about, permanently. They're not separated for a day or 2 days. They are permanently separated because they were killed by criminal illegal aliens. These are the families the media ignores. They don't talk about them.
Now you might say, hey, David, that's not deceptive. There are illegal immigrants who killed people, and these are the families of their victims. So what's wrong with that? Shouldn't we know if there are criminal illegal aliens? And I would say to you, sure, that's a problem. We should focus on all people in the U.S. who commit violent crimes, whether they're here legally or not. The problem is that when you have to stop and think about why Donald Trump did this rally and gave the speech, the insanity of it surfaces. The bad PR is around the separation of children from their families, the separation of children from parents who aren't even breaking laws in some cases because they're coming to the border and seeking asylum, not entering the United States illegally. And Donald Trump is pushing back against critics who say caging kids is bad by saying some illegal immigrants killed people. He's holding the rally to make people afraid of dangerous immigrants. And then, of course, the biggest insanity of this all is that undocumented immigrants commit less crime than native-born Americans. We have data from the Libertarian Cato Institute about criminality in Texas. And what you will see is that native-born Texans commit crimes, including all crimes in general, but also specifically homicide and larceny, at higher rates than both documented and undocumented immigrants. So if you're holding a rally merely to warn people about who's dangerous by crime rate, you have to be way more afraid of, in this case, native-born Texans than undocumented people in Texas. One more set of data for you. At the state level, higher rates of undocumented immigrants correlate to a lower crime rate from 1990 to 2014. The data's clear. We did an entire long-form piece about this on The Truth About Illegal Immigration. You can find out more about this issue by checking out that video. Last thing on this, the economic side. I hate to break it to anybody who's finding comfort and solace in the immigrants are bad because they're taking our jobs thing. But if you lost your job to an immigrant, shouldn't you be blaming the business owner who took advantage of the immigrant at your expense to lower their costs and increase their profits? The people hiring the immigrants are the ones that are laughing all the way to the bank because you're mad at the immigrants instead of them. This is free market capitalism, or at least it's what I call it, Pat, is free where we want it to be free capitalism. And I know we've gone over this before, but how can the immigrants be both lazy welfare recipients, vagabonds who don't want to work, and taking so many jobs that real Americans like you can no longer find one? Explain that to me.
And you'll never see Republicans blame the business owners who hire these illegal immigrants. No, they'll give them a tax cut.
Every once in a while, they will say, And we should also enforce the law when it comes to businesses that hire undocumented immigrants. But they don't really have the political will to do it. Absolutely immoral what is happening here. You can discuss this with us on our subreddit at davidpakman.com/REDDIT. Yet another day and yet another example of a federal law violation by Donald Trump targeting a specific company on Twitter. I'm starting to feel as though the English language is being pushed to its limits to adequately explain the crisis level stuff that's going on right now with this administration. Trump is now threatening Harley Davidson with being, quote, taxed like never before if they move overseas, which they're being pushed to do because of Donald Trump's own tariffs. So I want to break this down step by step for you. Donald Trump started a trade war. He put tariffs on Chinese, European, Canadian goods. As predicted, the countries that were tariffed by Donald Trump decided that they were going to put in place retaliatory tariffs. This is how trade wars work, completely unsurprising. And as a result, we've had some American companies, Harley Davidson being one example, announce that they're going to move some element of their business overseas. In Harley Davidson's case, they are going to try to get around tariffs that would increase the cost of each motorcycle by 2,200s by moving production of their European market motorcycles out of the United States. So Harley moving that production overseas is a direct response to the repercussions of Donald Trump's trade war. When Harley Davidson announced, hey, this is what we're going to have to do, Donald Trump goes on Twitter and he threatens Harley with punitive taxation, tweeting yesterday, quote, "A Harley Davidson should never be built in another country. Never. Their employees and customers are already very angry at them. If they move, watch, it'll be the beginning of the end. They surrendered. They quit. The aura will be gone and they will be taxed like never before." Understand what's happening here. Trump first hurts Harley Davidson by starting a trade war. Harley reacts to save their revenue, and Trump says, I will hurt you even more if you try to get out from under the destructive effect of the trade war that I started. Trump forced them to make a business decision, and now he's going to punish them for making that business decision to try to save their profits. And of course, it won't matter to Trump supporters. Trump supporters will say, you know, it's Obama's fault because he was weak on trade, or congressional Democrats obstructed fixing trade deals, so Trump had to do this, and Trump's just going to have to be tough in order to make this right, which of course makes no sense, since the whole point of fixing trade was to be good for American businesses, not so terrible for American businesses that they say, wow, we have to save ourselves and offshore even more jobs, which is exactly what's going on. I was thinking about how the EU targeting Harley Davidson is actually kind of clever, because Harley is seen as this kind of heartland American icon. And by putting Harley Davidson in a position to have to make this decision, Harley is in a position where conservatives will have to decide, do we denounce Harley because we're supposed to see Harley as this American icon, but at the same time, if we say we support what Harley Davidson is doing, we're kind of criticizing Donald Trump because we're admitting that this is what they have to do because of Trump's trade war. And the real lesson is that trade war a policy by Trump is haphazard, and it's also a loser's policy. Trump can't win it, right? We can go into the esoteric economic details, or we can just understand that in broad strokes, Trump can't win the trade war. Businesses are going to suffer. Middle-class Americans are going to suffer. And I don't take pleasure in this. Every time we talk about this, Pat, people email in and they say, David, you anti-American freak, you're pleased by what's going on. No, first of all, if you say that, you must acknowledge that there are bad things going on. That's number one. So why don't you just criticize the policy as opposed to criticizing me? I don't take pleasure in 400-point swings in the Dow. I don't take pleasure in the exploding of oil prices that we're now seeing. And I certainly don't take pleasure in this economic instability. I'm just not going to sugarcoat it for you. I've got to tell you the truth.
I thought we were supposed to be sick and tired of all the winning at this point in
Yeah.
Trump's presidency. We're not really seeing that.
We're not seeing it. We're not seeing it with Harley Davidson. And I also want to give you another example of Jack Daniel's whiskey that is really going to suffer under Trump's trade war. Another day, another racist faux pas by a Republican that you're just not allowed to call out, because if you notice their racism, you are playing the race card. If you believe that, I feel sorry for you. An ex-Trump advisor went on Fox News and called the black Democrat, quote, out of his cotton-picking mind. Of course, the term cotton picking refers to when in the South of the U.S. in the late 1700s, the early 1800s, black slaves picked cotton. Lou Dobbs years ago once had one of these weird incidents. If Lou Dobbs is before your time, I know we have some younger viewers on the show. He used to be sort of a prominent CNN anchor who hosted a, quote, money show. And I think he's now on Fox Business if that show hasn't been canceled. Here's Lou Dobbs almost accidentally using the term 10 years ago.
We're living with the issue of race. We've got to be able to talk about it. And I can guarantee you this, not a single one of these these just ridiculous politicians should be the moderator on the issue of race.
Right. When talking about how great things are racially, he calls politicians, referring in fact to Condi Rice, who happens to be black in that segment, cotton picking. Just cringe. So cut to this weekend. Here is former Trump advisor David Bossie, quote, debating or engaging in dialogue with a black Democratic strategist named Joel Payne, and out says cotton picking. Take a look.
Here. Final point, David.
Michael Hayden,
All right,
look,
you said that about David. David,
Michael Hayden posted a picture of Auschwitz. Donnie Deutsch is talking.
That liberal
look,
Michael Hayden. Yeah,
look,
that screaming liberal Michael Hayden.
You're out of your cotton-picking mind.
Cotton-picking mind? Brother, let me tell you something. Let me tell you something. I got some relatives who pick cotton.
Ridiculous.
And I'm not going to allow you to attack me like that on TV. I'm not out of my cotton-picking mind.
You're out of your mind. You're out of your mind.
He
said
you're
out
of your mind.
Gentlemen,
we're going to leave it right there.
This is ridiculous.
Ed Henry panicking, saying, hey, he said you're out of your mind. Very quickly got out of control. Eventually, David Bossie did apologize for his choice of words, tweeting, quote, during a heated segment on Fox and Friends today, I should have chosen my words more carefully and never used the offensive phrase that I did. I apologize to Joel Payne, Fox News, and its viewers. So the apology is fine. Most Trumpists don't apologize, so even getting an apology is something. But the reality is that the problem isn't just that he said it. It's that as soon as he's in disagreement with a black guy, he immediately, either consciously or subconsciously, goes to cotton picking. And the question is why? And even wackier is that the conversation was about civility in politics and whether it was appropriate for Michael Hayden to tweet a picture of Auschwitz as an analogy to what's going on with the child internment camps. And as you see on the screen behind me, their own headline for the thing was "The left's racist rants continue," as the guy from the right calls the black guy on the left out of his cotton-picking mind. Could this have been, Pat, some kind of avant-garde performance art? Is it possible that David Bossie was on Ambien at the time, and the Ambien maybe got him to say this wacky thing? There are people defending him online. Like, imagine this being the hill that you die on. People online are defending David Bossie, saying that he's a child of the 70s. And any child of the 70s has cotton picking as part of their lexicon with no racial connotations, and it just comes out reflexively. And if that's the argument, my question is, why is it that the incidents in media tend to be white Republicans using the term cotton picking when talking to or about black people? Is it another one of those coincidences?
Yeah, and why didn't he mention that in the apology? It's weird because whenever I get angry, I don't become a racist. I think it could have been the Ambien.
I don't all of a sudden incorrectly use that term. Yeah, that's the other thing that always comes up, which is, well, you apologize for the use, but it's clearly what you automatically go to when you become frustrated with someone. In this case, when you become frustrated with a black guy who, quite frankly, was making him look pretty stupid on Fox News. We have even more fallout from this harebrained, ill-thought-out trade war. I don't personally drink Jack Daniel's whiskey, but many people do. And in Europe, many people also like Jack Daniel's whiskey. And those European customers are going to have to pay 10% more for Jack Daniel's whiskey as a direct result of Donald Trump's trade war. The European Union has placed a number of retaliatory tariffs against American products as a result of this trade war put in place by Donald Trump. We've talked about how Harley Davidson is moving some production out of the United States. And American whiskey manufacturer Jack Daniels is going to have to bump up prices in Europe by 10%. And what's going on is that over the next few months, the distributors that European beverage spirit distributors have are going to start going away. They're going to have to start buying more to replenish those supplies, and they're going to have to do that at a 10% higher cost. That 10% price increase is obviously going to be passed along to the European consumers of the whiskey. And what you're going to see is some European consumers saying, well, I don't want to pay 10% more for Jack Daniels. I will go with a different whiskey, maybe Japanese whiskey, increasingly popular, maybe some other.
What about Jameson? Irish whiskey.
Yeah, oh, that's another possibility. And if you think, well, who cares? It's not a big deal. Jack Daniels doesn't really sell that much in Europe. Wrong. Actually, 25% of Jack Daniels' revenue comes from European sales. So think about it. We were told that Donald Trump's mere presence in the White House, never mind his economic policy, was just going to be masterfully wonderful. It's going to be an incredible amount of winning. The American business class is going to win. The American middle class is going to win. But instead, we're seeing the opposite. We're seeing that companies are being hurt and workers are being hurt by the economic policy. If you can even call it that, I call it fumbling around in the dark. But I want to remind you about what Trump himself said. Trade wars are good and trade wars are easy to win. Doesn't seem to be working out. And unfortunately, because of Donald Trump's ego, he can't back out of it now. Trump is so dug into this bogus policy that if anything, he's going to double down on the policy before he backs out of it. And he's now calling out the companies that he's hurting, as we talked about, calling out Harley Davidson on Twitter. Trump's making threats as a result of his own destructive policy. And the best way that I can describe it is that this is a weak man's strong man. And then in addition to the damage that actual price increases are going to do, the movement to boycott American products is growing. We talked about the Canadian effort to avoid American products because of this hostility and trade war starting from Donald Trump. There's a European movement to choose non-American products when there is an option. And this is the bet that Donald Trump is making. He's going to have to sleep in it. And unless we don't hold him accountable, he might actually face some repercussions. That's my concern. He's making the bed. Make the guy sleep in it by voting in November and voting in 2020. That's the only way.
I think there is a chance he'll back down. Remember, he did that for the child separation, family separation for immigrants.
Yeah.
Once Republicans and the public at large went against him, he decided to backtrack a little bit. If corporate interests get involved here, if the Koch brothers get involved, maybe we'll see a change of heart.
Yes and no, because he did make a public declaration and sign an order that he was going to take care of the child internment problem. But it was just the vaguest of executive orders, And I don't actually know that he's really fixed the problem. In fact, it appears as though now there are even missing kids that are supposed to be in government custody. I don't expect any backtracking. I would expect doubling down before I see backtracking from Trump. You can discuss this with us on our subreddit at davidpakman.com/REDDIT. We are going to take a very, very quick break, newly shortened commercial breaks, and then we'll be back. Back in 1974, 43% of Americans said that President Richard Nixon should be impeached. This was from a Harris poll done in March of 1974. Right now, 42% of Americans believe that Donald Trump should be impeached, according to a new SSRS poll. And for people saying that lots of people always want the president impeached, that's sort of true, but not to this degree. For example, at the height of the Bill Clinton scandal, only 29% of Americans wanted Clinton impeached. And as you might know, Nixon eventually resigned in August of 1974, just 5 months after that 43% number was hit. But there's a key difference between when Nixon resigned and what is going on with Donald Trump, which is that Nixon ultimately resigned, not so much because 43% of Americans wanted him impeached, but because Republicans, his own party, had lost faith in him. When we look at what's going on today, Republicans mostly still love Trump. So I don't believe that we can expect that to end the exact same way. There's another key difference right now, which is that Richard Nixon didn't have Fox News. They didn't have the 24/7 propaganda machine of right-wing media supporting the Nixon administration. And even if at any given time, only 1% or so of the United States population is watching any particular show on Fox News. Fox News does have a sort of right-wing agenda-setting ability, and that is a catalyst for really effective talking points in defense of Trump that end up being used by people who don't even necessarily get them from Fox News. One other difference is that Donald Trump is still polling approval-wise in the high 30s, which is sort of the same point as saying Republicans still support the guy. And then one other difference today compared to 1974 with Nixon is that the electoral map is way different today than it was during the 1970s. And so as a result, I've said this before, this isn't new, impeachment shouldn't be a policy item for Democrats going into the November elections, the midterms, and mostly it isn't, because you can't run on impeaching the president since it depends on so many things, and it's not policy, especially when the replacement is Mike Pence. If Democrats run on, we will impeach the president when we get elected and take over the House and Senate in 2018, in practical terms, you're running on making Mike Pence president of the United States. It also simply can't happen if Democrats don't take over the House and Senate, especially when even that can be sort of a losing battle unless Republicans change their mind. Nixon would have held on and on and on if Republicans had stayed with him. You can't win a fight against people without moral and ethical standards, meaning that this is merely a practical matter. Republicans stay with Trump, you're not going to see impeachment or resignation. So Democrats need a real platform for 2018, and we're about 4 months away, and it needs to be developed right now, because the one target needs to be for Democrats to take over the House and Senate in November. If Democrats can take over the House and Senate, you potentially get net neutrality back, which is a massive meta issue for the propaganda war. You neuter the Trump agenda, because if you take over the House and Senate, you relegate Donald Trump to the executive orders that he denounced under Barack Obama. And given Trump's authoritarian tendencies, if it starts to look really bad for Republicans in the House and Senate as we get closer to November, I would start to wonder, are we going to see authoritarian type moves from Trump? And by that, I mean preemptively arguing that the election is invalid, some kind of terrorist attack to fire up his base, firing Robert Mueller to create chaos and maybe try to swing things back towards Republicans in an act of desperation. I don't know. And I normally say no way to the mere possibility of these things happening, but we've gotten pretty far off course during the last 2 years of Trump. So I would be very concerned, number one, if Democrats don't get a real platform together for the midterms, I would almost completely write off the possibility of taking over the House and Senate. I hope that doesn't happen. But if it starts to look like Democrats might actually have some success there, what does the Trump administration and Trump's lackeys, what do they do to try to retain control beyond January of 2019 when the new House and Senate would be sworn in? I want to start today talking about this little thing called the Constitution. Donald Trump, his team, his staffers, his supporters, they've been carrying on about the rule of law and the Constitution and how under their watch we are going to have the rule of law in this country. We're going to have law and order. And if I say to you the rule of law in the United States, the definition of it is general but also precise in a way. The rule of law is, quote, the restriction of the arbitrary exercise of power by subordinating it to well-defined and established laws. The arbitrary exercise of power. Keep that in mind. In our country, just because law enforcement says you did something or thinks that you did something, before a particular punishment is carried out, before the allegations are put into sort of a final decision phase, there is a process of the law. And when it comes to undocumented immigration, if law enforcement thinks someone came to the country illegally, you still have a legal process which confirms the circumstances and looks at the facts. And only when that has been refereed by the justice system do you move forward with, for example, the punishment of deportation. I'm ignoring, by the way, that there are two justice systems in the U.S., one for the rich, one for the poor. But for this story, that's not actually the main focus. Donald Trump said yesterday that he wants people who come into the United States illegally deported immediately without any judicial process. Donald Trump tweeted, quote, "We cannot allow all of these people to invade our country. When somebody comes in, we must immediately, with no judges or court cases, bring them back from where they came." Our system, but weird grammar, but we understand what he's saying. Our system is a mockery to good immigration policy and law and order. He actually mentions law and order in a tweet calling for the total elimination of the rule of law, and this is what we would call unconstitutional. This would violate due process, and there actually is some debate among constitutional scholars, a group to which Donald Trump doesn't belong, in case you weren't sure about that. Constitutional scholars do debate the extent or degree to which all aspects of the Constitution apply to non-citizens, to people who are here illegally or to people who are residents but not citizens. But there is no question that canceling trials for suspected undocumented immigrants is completely unconstitutional. The Supreme Court has already decided that anybody in the United States, whether you're here legally or illegally, you are entitled to due process of law. It goes to the second half of Section 1 of the 14th Amendment, and it's very clear that it applies to all persons. There are parts of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights that make a distinction about the rights of citizens versus the rights of all persons, but there is no question whatsoever that there is a right to due process for people who are in the United States, regardless of how they got here. So there are people online. Now, let's take a step back. Supposedly, Trumpists and Trump and the right are advocates of the Constitution. They are defenders of the Constitution. They say we like Trump because he will enforce law and order and the rule of law. So the constitutional right should be up in arms and absolutely furious about this idea from Donald Trump, because it's a direct violation of their stated value of defending the Constitution. But I checked the forums online. I went to the normal enclaves of bottom-feeding pond scum online, and they're loving this idea from Donald Trump. Here are some examples that I came across. Quote, "If they're illegal, we don't need to waste time and money with courts. Just get them out." Another comment, correct as usual about Trump's idea of just kicking people out with no due process. And quote, "He is correct. Illegals have zero rights here. Get them out." The Constitution doesn't work this way. And I have a call out. I'm formally putting the call out right now, Pat. Make a note of this, please. If there are any so-called constitutional conservatives who are ready to stand up and say this cannot be allowed to happen, I am going to put party aside and say this is an attack on the basic fundamental tenets upon which our country is based. Let me know, because I want to hear from those people.
This actually is surprising in a way, because conservatives always argue the due process point on the topic of guns.
Yeah.
Like sometimes there'll be a push to take people who are on the no-fly list or the terrorist watch list and make it harder them for access to guns and even maybe take the guns away. Conservatives say that would violate their due process.
That's exactly
so
right.
This.
Because being put on a list is not a judicial adjudication of any kind, right? You appear on a list and all of a sudden you lose rights that are granted to you either by statute or court precedent or the Constitution and Bill of Rights. That would violate due process, they say. Well, then this absolutely would. And I actually am curious, even going beyond, I think the ship has sailed with most so-called constitutional conservatives who support Trump. They're going to come up with some reason to either just ignore this or defend it. But what about government agencies? Are there government agencies that would actually be doing what it is Trump is suggesting here, that are going to be willing to stand up and say, we're not going to do it, because whatever our political disagreements are about immigration policy or quotas or country of origin or whatever, even if you think we want people from Norway and we don't want people from Guatemala, like Trump has suggested, you can still say, but we've got to do what the Constitution says. I hope that there will be government agencies that do that. I'm sure that the heads of those agencies will very quickly find themselves fired by Donald Trump, however.
It'll come down to the individuals at the respective agencies. I think just like with the child detention fiasco, there will be some whistleblowers, some people who take a stand and say, we're not going to go through with this. Others will go along with it.
I think you're probably right. And this is a direct attack on the Constitution. And I wish that we could get beyond partisanship, whether it was Obama was accused of doing this stuff. Of course, he wasn't actually doing it. Trump really is, right? There were no FEMA camps under Obama. There really are child internment camps under Trump. President Obama wasn't trying to suspend the rule of law. Donald Trump is actually saying, get rid of due process altogether and just start kicking people out on the say-so of, I guess, Border Patrol agents. I don't even know who. This is a crisis, and we actually have multiple crises to talk to you about today.